Hey everybody, welcome back. In this demo, we're going to go ahead and set up a new online repository within GitHub. Now to follow along with this demo, you will need a GitHub account and you should have completed the earlier demonstration where we set up a local repository using my sample Aussie Mart web application. Because within this demonstration, we're going to set up a new GitHub repository and then we're going to synchronize our local repository with this online remote repository. So if you don't actually already have a GitHub account, just make sure you go ahead, click on the sign up option and follow the steps. You'll be prompted for an email address. You'll need to create a new username for your GitHub account, and that will be how you access your repositories. And you can follow some other steps there. Throughout the sign up wizard, if you are asked what sort of plan you'd like to use, you can go ahead and use the free plan. Okay, so what we need to do is go ahead and sign into GitHub, and then we can go about creating a new online repository. So we'll go ahead and sign in right now. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create a new repository. Now, before I do that, I will just call out that if you skip the earlier demonstration where we set up our own local repository, but you still want to have an online repository that contains the Aussie Mart sample application, then what you can actually do is go to the link that I have provided within the description for this video. You'll see it provides a link to my GitHub repository for the Aussie Mart web store application. But importantly, it's got this little portion here that says fork. If you go to that URL, it's going to give you the ability to create a new repository within your GitHub account that is actually a copy of my Aussie Mart web repository. However, if you have completed the earlier demonstration, then what we actually want to do is create a new repository and synchronize that from our local repository using the Git command line interface. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and click on Create Repository. You'll see that we're creating a new repository underneath your username. If you do actually have access to an organization, like we spoke about within the lesson, then you'll see you can create repositories under those entities as well. However, for us, we're going to create a repo under our account. So you can just go ahead and pick whatever repo name you would like here. I'm going to name this My Web Store, for example. I'm not going to bother with a description for now. I am going to leave this as public just so we don't have to worry too much about access control. But if you are wondering about what public means, it's going to mean that anyone can see the code in your repository, so don't put anything secret in there. However, they can't make changes to your repository unless you approve those changes or unless you provide them with access. Now, we don't need to worry about a README file or a gitignore file because those are already included within the sample app that we have running locally. So that's all we need to do. You can go ahead and click on Create Repository. Now to make things really simple, you'll see GitHub has automatically provided a range of different commands that you can use to get started with your new repository. For us, the one we want to focus on is in the middle. We have an existing repository that we want to push from the command line to our new remote repository that we've configured in GitHub. So these are the commands that I want you to complete. What we're going to do is we're going to perform these commands from the command line in the local repository that you created earlier. Let's just take a look at what we're talking about here. The first command is going to update our local repository settings and state that this new GitHub repository that we have just created is the remote repository for our repository. And it's actually doing so by typing git remote add, and you'll see this name here, origin. Now you can call that whatever you want. You might actually call that GitHub. If you are working with Azure DevOps, for example, you might call it Azure. It's really up to you. Origin is just a standard that has been commonly been used to refer to your online remote repository. So that's what we'll do. We'll say git remote add origin, and we'll put in the remote repository that we just created. Next, GitHub is actually including the command here git branch -m main, just to make sure that your local repository does use the name main for your branch, because that's the naming strategy that is employed through your GitHub repo. Finally, when you are ready to go, you're going to perform your git push command. Now, this is a command you're going to be performing regularly whenever you make any changes. If you have staged your changes, committed your changes locally, and you're ready to synchronize that with your online repository, this is where you'll use the git push command. Now, you might be wondering, what is this part here that says -u origin main? This is actually just a little bit of some extra arguments you can add to your git push command that's going to make sure that your local repository understands that it's actually kind of connected to the remote repository main branch. This is something that we call tracking, and it just ensures that you can easily check the status of your local repository against the remote repository. All right, we've got everything that we need ready to go. Let's take a copy of all of these commands to make things nice and simple for us, and then I'm going to browse across to my terminal. Now you'll see I'm logged in here, ready to go in the local repository that we configured earlier. If I take a look at the folders, we can see we've got all the files and folders that we set up. So I'll clear the screen, and what we want to do is we actually want to paste in those commands. But before we do so, I want to call out what's going to happen. We'll paste in those commands, and the git push command is going to try and write to our online GitHub repository. Now, before it's going to be able to do that, it needs to authenticate. So to authenticate from your computer, there's a couple of ways that you can do so. You can do so using a personal access token, and I'll include a link within the description below this video to help provide you more information on how you can do that. Or one of my preferred methods is to actually use something referred to as a credential helper. Now, if you check out the description below this video, you'll see I've also included a link to the Git Credential Manager. That's a tool that is multi-platform, can work on Linux, Mac, Windows, and it can help you to more easily connect into accounts like GitHub, Azure DevOps, and it even has support for things like two-factor authentication. So I've already got that installed. If you haven't, I would encourage you to install that now before we proceed. Or if you prefer, you can just use that personal access token. You can create one from your GitHub account and you can paste that in as your password. The other point that I wanted to mention is that you can actually encounter some issues from the command line if you authenticate against multiple different GitHub accounts. Now, if that is the case, you are working with lots of different GitHub accounts, you might want to enter in the command that I have pasted here that I've included within a description below. This is just going to go and ensure that when you actually go and authenticate against GitHub using the Git CLI, it's going to make sure that the repository is included in that authentication. Otherwise, you're going to have one account that's trying to log in against all your different repos, even if they're on different GitHub accounts. So you can type that in. That'll make sure the repository is factored in, and that'll make sure that you can use different accounts for different repositories. So now that I've completed those steps, what I can do is I can paste in the command that we copied earlier from GitHub, and I can go ahead and press enter. Now, if you haven't already authenticated, you hopefully should get that pop-up that's asking you to authenticate with your GitHub credentials. I've already done so, so it's gone straight ahead and pushed that repo up to my GitHub repository. If you didn't install Git Credential Manager, then you would need to use a personal access token that you can configure using the instructions I provided earlier. Okay, so we've completed those commands. What we can do is we can browse back to GitHub. And if we now go ahead and refresh this page, fantastic. You can see you've got the sample Aussie Mart web application ready to go within your own repository. And we can use this later for things like GitHub Actions or Azure DevOps pipelines. So everybody, that's all there is to it for this demonstration. You've got a GitHub account ready to go. You've created that new online repository, and you should have synchronized your local repository to this repository. Now, if you want to make any further changes, you can absolutely go ahead and do so. All you'll need to do is go back to your local terminal, make those changes on your computer, and remember to add those changes to your staging area, commit them locally, and then use the git push command, which is now going to synchronize with your GitHub repository. Thanks for joining me, folks. I hope you've enjoyed it, and that's a wrap.